Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the KRVIA Encounters. I'm Janvi Menon, and today we have Gurmeet S. as our speaker. Gurmeet Rai, an architect with specialization in heritage, has worked on conservation of heritage sites, planning for historic areas, and policy documents in both India and abroad. In 2015, she was appointed Grid City Anchor for the historic site of Amritsar and Puri by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, Government of India. Gurmeet has been an advisor to UNESCO in the heritage sector in several countries in Southeast Asia. She was appointed as lead consultant for the preparation of the cultural heritage policy for Punjab in 2011. In 2012, the World Monuments Fund, New York, appointed her as project management consultant for the conservation of 43 projects, monuments in Madhya Pradesh. Gurmeet received the award of distinction from UNESCO for 2 projects under the Asia Pacific Architecture Heritage Awards in 2002 and 2004. Thereafter, for over 15 years, she has been on the jury of Asia Pacific Architecture Heritage Awards of UNESCO. She is currently a member of steering committee of the TIRA 2022, the World Congress on Earthen Architecture Heritage, to be organized by the Getty Conservation Institute in Santa. In 2021, she was appointed as Heritage Specialization for the Conservation Planning of Parliament House in New York Times. We welcome you, Gurmeet. You could start with the
Is it possible for you to see the presentation in this one? This one? Yeah, that's good. It's wonderful to be here and good to see our house full. A small correction, the conservation plan was for the Parliament in New Delhi and not New York. Okay. So, what I hope to share with you today is my journey as a conservation architect while working in the city of Amritsar. And I just thought it will just be a more coherent way of explaining the work of a conservation practitioner, because we clearly, I mean, at least I have clearly engaged with government organizations. So you're not the master of destination of any of your projects entirely. And it becomes a process. And conservation in any case has got to do with the process and the product itself. So okay, better now? Yeah. So principally, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Amritsar, and it is in the state of Punjab. And my work as a conservation architect has been more in what I would describe as a provincial architect. And this is something which I learned from my mentor, Sir Bernard Fielding, who was knighted for his work in the York Minster Cathedral and is a person who brought in the first conservation program into India with the setting up of the first conservation department in the School of Planning in Delhi. And this is something which I heard Sir Bernard speak in the 90s, where he said, you know, you think global, but you work local. And he saw himself working in the area that he belonged, in the space of cultural heritage. So when I trained as a conservation architect, which was in 1990, I first worked with the INTAC, with the National Trust, for a certain number of years. And then I realized that when I was going to different places, to address or, basically to look at cultural heritage. There was, my tools were not ready in terms of how to understand heritage. There was not much referencing, there was not much work that had been done in the country by architects in the cultural heritage space. And the reference that we had was actually the work of archaeologists and civil engineers in the Archaeological Survey of India. So this slide broadly captures what once my journey has been, which is recognizing layers of heritage, recognizing communities, protection, conservation, enhancement, integration, improved management. Now, these are the words which resonate with me and kind of capture my learning in sector. When you look at the city of Amritsar, this is the walled city. On the left, you see the image of the 19th century image of the map of Amritsar, and what you see is it's a bean-shaped city, about a kilometer and a half in east-west direction, and about 2 kilometers in the north-south direction. In the heart of the city, right in the center, is you see the Golden Temple. And I would imagine most of you would be familiar with the site of the Golden Temple. There's a difference here between most cities. I'm not comparing medieval cities. The founding of Amritsar happened in the 16th century. And at that point, if you look at the medieval cities of northern India, you would find that the palaces or the forts are in the heart of the city, and then you have these bazaars, around the world, around the most important monument, which the king lives in, or the royal family lives in, and then you have all the mohallas or the neighborhoods all around, and then you have the walls. But here, what sits in the center of the city is the sacred site. And the satellite image, of course, shows you that the edges are very much intact of the walled city. What was the moat earlier in the 19th century has now been replaced by a circular road, which has several of the gates, 12 gates, and you have a very dense urban fabric. This is what the site looks like today. You have the shrine right in the center, a water body, which used to originally define the edge of the sacred site. So the site was not enclosed by a boundary wall or gates like that. It seamlessly merged into the urban fabric. That itself was quite a revelation to me, because we prepared the nomination dossier for this site for inscription for inclusion in the World Heritage List. And to be able to articulate the significance of the site, it was kind of very important for us to understand that what are the criteria under which we should nominate the site. And we are talking about the year 2002, when this nomination dossier was prepared. What came as a great surprise is today I was talking about the criteria 6 for World Heritage nomination. And here we realized that criteria 6 was the most important criteria, because right in the center of the shrine, which is a very small shrine, is, I'll just come to you by the thing. This is what it looks like when you get into the central hall, which is called the Prakash Sthan. And Prakash Sthan, you can understand Prakash is light, and Sthan is a place. So one way to understand the word is that it's a place which is lit. And the other way to understand it is that the Prakash comes from inside. It's a self-illuminated space, which means that what is the most critical part, the most important or the central part of this entire site is the holy book that sits in the center of the shrine. And that was a piece of writing, which is the holy book of the Sikh community, which was compiled in the early part of the 17th century in 1604, and placed in the shrine as then given the place of the living of the Guru of the teacher, of the entire community. So that's when we realized that in the nomination process, criteria 6 would be the most important criteria because it represents a work of writing, philosophy, captures the philosophy, the essence, which then goes and defines the architecture of the place. So the architectural principles or the planning principles of this particular site is a manifestation of the philosophy that is held within that particular holy book. So criteria 6 was a very important part of this particular nomination dossier. The work ethic was an important aspect for us to recognize because this 19th century painting represents the building of the temple. And reading nuances of a tradition through multi-dimensional materials or in the archival research is an important part of our craft as conservation architects. And what you see here is all these people who are working and building and the bricks that are being made, the community kitchen that is being prepared here, and people sitting around the Guru who got the temple built, which is the fifth Sikh Guru, Guru Arjan Dev. So this particular ethic of the work culture becomes an important part of our understanding of engaging with the cultural heritage space in the city of Amritsar while defining our tools and our methodologies and our principles of developing any kind of a conservation ethic for the city. Of course, looking at the entire map, which now sits with the Royal Geographic Society in London, the important features of the monuments that I am personally engaged with, which is, can you see my cursor? There's no pointer. Anyway, can you see the entire walled city and the Golden Temple? And to the left of it, towards the northwestern side, you see a fort. That's the Govindgarh Fort. What you see here, here it's come. So to this part, here. Yeah, this part is the summer palace of very important Maharaja of this part of the Sikh kingdom called Maharaja Ranjit Singh. There's a long narrative around him as a very, very important, lays some very significant, there's some significant contributions by him. And he founded the Sikh kingdom in the early part of the 19th century. And his capital city was Lahore. The winter capital was Lahore, and the summer capital was Amritsar. And that kind of defined several of the built features that we got to restore in the course of our work here. So the Govindgarh Fort was a military fort, which was built to protect the vulnerability of the walled city, which is actually the shrine itself. And then we also have the summer palace here. So this is very important features of the city. Looking at the cultural tradition of the settlement, this again is a 19th century painting, which okay, so now looking at, when you look at what all is happening in this particular painting, you've got the Golden Temple, you have a temple here, you have a mosque. There's the mosque. The mosque is here. And you look at all the craft tradition and the cultural practices all in this one painting. So in terms of understanding the intangible heritage of the creative industries of the city, which continue to exist even today, this particular painting was kind of quite a revelation. The new city. Now, the way the city has grown and the way the master plan addresses the development for the city, you've got the walled city right in the center, and then you've got the city as it exists today, and several concentric circles of the various bypasses that are being developed to bypass the city. This is the Grand Trunk Road, which leads to Lahore. This side goes to Delhi. So the northwestern part, southwestern part is going towards Lahore, and the southeastern part is going towards Delhi. So that's kind of the location of, Amritsar was not on the Mughal highway, but it was the Mughal road, which was built during the Mughal period, during, the patrons were Akbar, Jahangir, because we're talking about the connection between Lahore, Agra and Delhi, did not touch Amritsar. It's only when Punjab fell to the British Empire in 1849 is that the road was reoriented to get Amritsar on the road, because the East India Company kind of thought it was important. Amritsar was important enough to be on that particular road. So that is an important aspect in terms of orienting. This is what happens, the proposed development, the master plan itself. What you see on the left side that we were talking about, cultural mapping, is a lot of sacred sites, not sacred sites, I would say a lot of cultural heritage sites that we mapped, and we were trying to map the themes under which these historical buildings can be positioned. And I'll talk about that later, that how did we analyze when we did our mapping and we located all the historic sites. If you have to talk about it right now, we realized that the story of Amritsar, what gets told by its historic buildings, can be broadly classified under 5 different themes. And those themes are from inception, reverence, then it comes to revelation, because it's a layered history, resonance, when you think of the vibrancy of the cultural heritage or the lives of people and their lifestyles. We have and Amritsar has seen a lot of violence as well as part of the cultural narrative. The impact of partition was severe. 1984, Operation Blue Star was huge. And there are several other events. 1919, Jallianwala Bagh was very, very important. Now, when you look at the cultural narrative of the city, you see so much conflict and contestations that you realize that you cannot ignore that particular narrative. And this I'm talking about because when we were looking at the presentation of Khundabad as well, that when we are mapping heritage and understanding the cultural layers, to talk about contestation is an important aspect. Today, what the buzzwords are, we talk about sacred landscapes, we talk about all of that. But, where contestations is something which makes you uncomfortable, has to be recognized as well. And this is something which I learned a lot after studying the way the Germans have dealt with their narrative of what led to the World War II, the persecution of the Jewish community, and what all are they doing in terms of through cultural heritage engagement, dealing with the subject of reconciliation. So for us, the 5th word, one was resonance, and then after that was reconciliation, because you want to recognize all the layers of history, understand all the various attributes, and something which makes you uncomfortable is also something which needs to be recognized, because it's through the reason I strongly believe that our legacy of partition continues because we have not been able to bring a closure to that particular narrative of violence. And it becomes very serious when you are dealing with the landscape of a city like Amritsar. Some of the images which, like I showed you the references of the cultural practices in the 19th century paintings, you can see them even today. The continuity of the Seva tradition in the sacred sites. And it is not just confined to one religion. You find this kind of a tradition that actually goes across to other religions as well. Whether it's Islam or whether it's Hinduism, you find the same tradition and the same language being used. So the cross-pollination is something, if you care to look for it, you find it in cultural practices. The heritage street that has been created outside, within the walled city, outside the Golden Temple, that itself has its own very strange character. I'm using the word strange because when people like us, when architects decide to intervene and create spaces, and we think it is only for, we have to understand how it impacts human behavior. And we were talking about behavior change here. That if you look at Kenzo Tange's work in Lumbini and see how he kind of intervenes in the master planning to quieten the human being before they reach the sacred site. By sheer positioning of the visitor center and the distance that person traverses by walking to the site, which is the archaeological site, associated with the birth of Lord Buddha, he's evoking a certain human behavior. But the fact that what we are doing around the sacred site, without really understanding the values of the site, we're intervening with architectural forms and spaces, we're actually creating disruptions. There's a space around Amritsar leading up. A lot of cities have now started. I would say Amritsar actually is guilty of giving the country the first heritage street. And now everybody's creating heritage streets. And I'm, commissioners from government, urban local bodies are actually told, go and look at Amritsar to see what they have achieved. And people seem to be very proud of what we've created here. There have been corridors created everywhere on sacred sites. And what we're writing over, and heritage is a non-renewable resource. If you've lost it, you've lost it. In fact, in Varanasi, I went to look at the development that's when the demolition was happening to create that large area around Kashi Vishwanath Temple. I was talking to some of those people who live in that area. So one of the very learned Sanskrit scholars told me, he said, you have reduced our cultural narrative, which was a few thousand years old, you've reduced it to 300 years. Because what we've done there as architects, as a fraternity of architects, is we are linking with the layer of history which is associated with either Ahilyabai Holkar's time or the later monuments that you find. But Banaras has such an interesting legacy that there are layers within layers. Somebody will tell you there's a threshold which is sun symbol because this belongs to that particular period. So when all that mosaic of those tangible, edifices out there, people who have a sense of history and sense of cultural continuity are able to, from what they read in books, can actually relate to physical material culture and tell you what represents what period. But the moment we kind of, as architects and planners, come in and think we're going to be creating a great public space, I'm not saying that we don't need public spaces, but we tend to write over years and years of a particular tradition, a particular way of looking at our narrative as the cultural traditions. So anyway, so this is the crafts in the city, the bazaars around the city, and the map actually shows all the markets, the specialized markets that lead up to the Golden Temple, and all how people adapt, the richness in the way people adapt to tradition and are innovative in terms of picking up developing new skills. And we talk about startups, and it's this indigenous knowledge where people who used to work with paper in a particular way and now make kites and so on. They're the innovations, and these are the real startups which don't really get the adequate recognition, because that's where you see continuity in development of technology and livelihoods, which impacts the wide base of the masses. If you were to remove the roofs from all the buildings in the walled city of Amritsar, you'll actually get to see it look like one continuous karkhana. And karkhana is a very interesting word because, and the fact that you have a shop at the back and the production happening in front. We do kitchens now in hotels where we say this is what? The show kitchen. And we think it's a great thing we're producing in kitchens. But our cities are really show spaces of indigenous skills and innovation. food is a very important layer of history, of cultural tradition in Amritsar. Gastronomy is very, very huge. And you actually find these mono food pop-ups, like street food. So there'll be one person who's just doing samosas, or a person just doing lassi, and a person doing just that. So you've got a lot of these pop-ups across the landscape. And interestingly, while UNESCO recognizes gastronomy as one of the cultural pillars of cultural heritage, in India, the Ministry of Culture does not recognize food as part of the cultural, intangible heritage. I'm giving you all of this narrative is because when you kind of get down to planning and intervening in historic cities, you've got to be a little humble that what you're addressing is something which has got layers and layers and centuries of, layers which kind of, this is where the richness is. So while you're creating infrastructure, whether it's institutions or whether it's services or public spaces, there is an entire narrative that you need to recognize, and it takes a lifetime to understand. People who are associated, who don't form part of the narrative of the city, because like UNESCO says that history is written about princes, priests, and politicians, and written by the victors, the victorious. This is the layer of, just represents the photographs of people who have contributed to literature or are artists. Extreme right is Bhai Ram Singh, who's a very well-known, who requires to be a very well-known Indo-Saracenic architect. So as people of Bombay, while you celebrate a lot of Indo-Saracenic architecture here, with all the British architects, Bhai Ram Singh is somebody who built the Khalsa College, and he actually shared a lot of awards with the British Indo-Saracenic architects as well. And additionally, he came from the background of being a carpenter. And he was the first principal of the Mayo College of Art in Lahore. And his mentor was Lockwood Kipling, who's the father of Rudyard Kipling. And this is the art and craft movement of Punjab, which gave dignity to the craftsmen. And in fact, he was invited by Queen Victoria to come and design their house in it'll come to me, I've forgotten the name, as well as some Darbar halls in that, it'll come to me, the name of the Queen Victoria, the state properties, the royal properties in India. And the others, of course, are writers, and Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw is also from Amritsar. So Amritsar did have a large Parsi community, not a large, it's a small Parsi community, but I think we can't ignore Sam Manekshaw here. Looking at the current intervention as a planner, as a conservation architect, as somebody who brings in interdisciplinary approach in the historic city planning, and our experience in heritage sector has been that while my early years of cultural heritage practice we were trying very hard to engage with the Archaeological Survey of India, because Ministry of Culture was the one mandated to deal with cultural heritage. And over the years, it became Ministry of Tourism, because tourism started putting in a lot of money into heritage. In the sense, it was left for states to kind of propose areas of intervention, and under the development of destinations and so on, we actually worked with some sites in that. But the most useful area for intervention is that if you can intervene through the urban development departments or urban local bodies. The reason being that the jurisdiction on walled cities or inner cities is with the urban local bodies. So if you really want to make a difference to the lives of people, or you really want to make a difference to the material culture or the heritage fabric of a particular city, it's the urban local body which is central to the whole process. Tourism, I think, gives a very skewed approach to heritage management, to conservation and revitalization and so on. In recent years, there have been several smart cities, about 100 smart cities in the country, of which about 38 cities actually identify their historic core as the areas for area-based development, Amritsar being one of them. And KRVIA program was a program of Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, which was launched in 2015, and they identified 12 cities, historic cities, which required, where we were mandated as heritage professionals to prepare city KRVIA plans, where we were required to do heritage mapping, identify 5 zones of heritage significance. But I was appointed as the KRVIA anchor for Amritsar and Puri. But in Puri, we could find only 3 zones, so it's not something that it was sacrosanct. And we identified 5 zones in Amritsar. So what this particular image, this map shows is the zones that we identified. And what is critical here, what is important to see here is zone 1, 2, and 3. So while zone 1 is the walled city, zone 2 is the Ramba Garden, which was the summer palace of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, fractured over time during the British period and converted into a cantonment. That's where when the Jallianwala Bagh episode happened, the people who were getting arrested were actually being tied up to the trees in this particular area. That itself is a very interesting study talking about contested histories. And zone 3 is what is a military, under the jurisdiction of the military board, and has the Govindgarh Fort. In fact, Govindgarh Fort is it's a site that I've engaged with for several decades, or a decade and a half, because it's the first fort in India where the military has handed over the fort to the civilian government, and even the ownership has been transferred. But the goof up that the government did was, the secretary, she was Secretary Tourism, that she said that when the government is handing over, instead of going to the Department of Tourism, it actually, Department of Culture, the site was handed over to Department of Tourism. So it's like now the tail wags the dog. These are important parts because I know that as architects, you want to do physical intervention, and I'll come to that. But you've got to understand the context you're dealing with when it comes to heritage practice. So a lot of our time goes into understanding all these particular nuances, because it's a heritage is a public good, it's a public asset. Your client is the government, and you are your X number of years in the life of the monument. So it's not that you're going to design something in 6 months and build over 2 years. It's actually a building that's been there for 300 years, and your engagement with that site is about 10 years. So in all humility, you are part of the life of the building. The building is not part of your life as such. So in this map, we also, because when we were required to identify the heritage zones, we also looked at the current ongoing projects, which was part of our mandate. That you look at the ongoing projects and look at, and the whole intervention had to be driven by infrastructure improvement along within heritage zones. But delineation of heritage zones, in defining infrastructure was left for us as conservation professionals to define. So for me, heritage zones were that large. But for some other city anchors, even a gate was a heritage zone, like, 50 meters around a particular historic gate is a heritage zone. But for me, the historic walled city was a heritage zone. So that particular flexibility was left to us. Secondly, in terms of infrastructure development, does infrastructure mean only your roads and pathways and all of that, or are they infrastructure also social institutions? And that is also left. That is also how well you engage, how much you engage, and what it means for you to kind of sharpen your tools as a professional. That how do you want to work within a particular historic context? Mobility, we thought, was a very important aspect. And we did mapping of, I had urban planners and urban designers also part of my team, and mapping of road widths to be able to understand that can we kind of decentralize? Can we look at, within the master planning, can we look at the circular road, which kind of is the edge of the walled city, provided with the kind of infrastructure that is necessary so that you have multiple entrances leading to the Golden Temple and not just one. And secondly, can you remove the vehicles from the walled city or regulate the vehicles in such a way that can non-motorized vehicles be non-motorized mobility plan be operationalized within the World City. So these are the kind of studies that were done to see how much of an area, like 500 meters around the Golden Temple, is something by the norms, easily walkable, negotiable. 1 kilometer, again, is a walking distance of about 12 minutes. And we realized that this is something which, because when we did the nomination dossier, that's when we spoke about traffic calming. The traffic used to be, the parking was right outside the Golden Temple. And we realized that that particular idea settled with the local government, and although it morphed into that fancy heritage street, but traffic today stops about 200 meters or 300 meters away from the Golden Temple and you walk down. I would have liked the form of that whole thing to be different, the process to have been different. But that idea you have a good idea and you throw it into the universe, and I think it catches, it has its own time to make a difference. It may need not be in your own, contract period. So that part got pedestrianized, and now we do believe that a document like this sitting with the local government would also make some sense over time for a non-motorized planning for non-motorized movement with mobility within the World City. So we actually developed schemes for this. This was again something which wasn't, when we did the Hriday scheme, it was very creatively thought out by the National Institute of Urban Affairs. The budget allocation for each of the cities was determined by the population. So while Varanasi got 80 crores, Amritsar got 69 crores. But they said, look, when you're doing the city plan, you follow the process of mapping, identifying your heritage zones, identify your projects, but don't think about the 60 crores. See all that is needed to be able to make a difference within the historic city. So we did a plan which went up to 750 crores. And then it's like taking a person's blood pressure, no? You put the pressure very high, it goes all the way up, and then you release it and it comes and settles somewhere. So it was a very interesting exercise that, when we say government is doing this wrong and government is doing that wrong, you also see that there are a lot of creative ways that even government functions. So I thought that was a very interesting idea that they threw at us. But think of all the projects and then zoom into what can be done and what can be the low-hanging fruits. And we were all part of the process of thinking. So one of the projects that we identified was this junction between the zone 1 and zone 3, which is the Rambagh Gates. And zone 3, which was the summer palace of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And this axis that connected, this was the cultural route that was followed by Maharaja Ranjit Singh to come from the summer palace to go to the Golden Temple. So we kind of identified this as an important part to be part of the 60 crore investment. This is what the gate looked like. In fact, when the British took over, when East India Company took over the city of Amritsar, they actually housed the Kotwali within this particular gates. And they demolished all the other medieval gates and by 1857, India came under the British crown and not the East India Company anymore. They created new gates. So when you go to the city of Amritsar, all the other 11 gates are colonial period gates, whereas this is the only surviving Maharaja Ranjit Singh standard. And that's when the ramparts were pulled down and they filled up the moat and made the circular road there. So that transformation was important. And this one actually had like I said, the Kotwali, which became the police station. And during the period of militancy, this was the central investigating agency. I mean, a lot of interrogation and all used to happen here. So people were completely disconnected from this particular monument. Something control F5 or something. Get into presentation mode. Is that? I'll do the presentation mode. Okay, Bala. Look at the PowerPoint. Yeah. The people who lived around the Ramba Gate, actually, who live around the Ramba Gate are the ones who came from Pakistan. So in terms of linkage between association of the site with the monument, association of the people with the monument, you're looking at people who came from Pakistan, and if you were to interview them and say, look, Yapka heritage, what do you think about it, and all that? First of all, they didn't belong here, and second, their recent memory was that of the police station and the interrogation center. So when you want to understand conservation and adaptive reuse, does it come flying from about what you want to do to the monument, or do you have to develop methodologies to understand that how do you anchor a monument within the community and the current community? Part of the ramparts, the ones that were pulled down by the British, there was a segment of it which still survived, and on top there was this rundown building, and in which there was a government school. The children studying in the government school came from what they said economically very, very poor background, and there were 5 classes running out of 2 rooms. There was a 100-year-old printing press on the top of the ramparts, built during the British period, still active, used by the municipal corporation for guide. So they bought the old machines as well. This is the kind of conditions that were inside the printing press. The market all around, which was a very interesting mix of everyday things to specialized pickles and stuff like that, and vegetables, seedlings, a wholesale mandi of people working with metal and so on. So a very interesting Rambagh Bazaar there. Now, what was going to be our intervention? Because here we were going to now conserve this building, find a meaning, we kind of understood the layers of history of this particular city and all our challenges and all our questions. And we have this monument right in front of us and a particular street that connects 2 important sites. First of all, we relocated the police station to recover this particular. We undertook the structural conservation of this of the structure, which of course required some interventions of, like you see this particular archway. This infill that you see, which looks very decorative within the arch, is actually a colonial period intervention. So we had to take some very serious decisions whether we want to reverse it to something which was the typology of the medieval period, or do we want to retain all the layers of history. We also realized that we should not just work with the gates, we should also look at the other stakeholders, which is if the school children who are studying there, the printing press that happens to be there, and whether we can respond to the needs of all the community, all the stakeholders engaged with the monument. Because the argument that I had with the local government, the municipal commissioner, she said, "In sabko to nikalna padega, ye to tourism ki side banegi." Now that itself is a problem. That everything that is conserved and beautified, because that's a very important, that's a word that we all work with. Government likes beautification, and it comes at the cost of removing meanings. Then I worked on the roundabout as well about area improvement, whether we could instill a sense of aesthetics by way of small interventions, which could be, because while we were working on the monument, it wasn't of any interest to anybody, we imagine. And also the fact that if you engage with the people, it becomes a memory, it becomes, whether to be told about something is one thing, and to actually work with your hands and use other senses of your existence becomes a body, it becomes a memory of a body. So we realized that the only way to draw attention of the market towards the monument would be is to work on their facades. It becomes a dialogue between the monument and the larger area. So some of these techniques we kind of developed in the course of developing the conservation and the revitalization plan. We did try to slow down the traffic around the roundabout by providing some of these tabletop crossings. And then we later found that some people thought it was a very nice place to park their cars. Anyway, so we got rid of the infill, the colonial period infill, and opened up the arch. And we did restore the printing press as well. We restored the school. We thought the children deserved better place for their education. We worked in the market also, all around. Gave them these cobble streets, put the drain in the center. They were very upset about it because the drains were on both the sides. And it used to get, covered with, closed with or clogged with solid waste. We put it in the center and it gave us the opportunity. So it became very difficult for the scooter wallahs to bring their things. A couple of times people slipped and of course cursed us. But we thought that was the best way to ensure cleaning of the drains, as well as through a design intervention, try to pedestrianize the street around the bazaar and then give a safer place for the pedestrians to walk in. So we developed, we sat in the markets while drawing these elevations out, because we thought if people have any resistance, they will come. So instead of working in our studios and bringing out a design and getting the contractor to deal with the shopkeeper and paint the facade, we actually sat in the market and developed the elevations. And the color palette that we followed was that of from the Sikh school of painting, which is found at Lahore and some remnants in Amritsar now. This was the first time that I actually was, this doesn't look scarlet red, it looks maroon. The photograph makes it look like that, but I really thought that it was important for us to, that the monument needs to scream out loud about its presence. We have to get people out of their state of amnesia. We have to position the monument in the lives of the people. We have to take history outside the classroom into the streets of a city. So for the first time, I actually was bold enough to develop a color palette for the gate. So these are all light-based paints, but we still thought it was important to do this. I've already spoken to you about the themes. That now the idea was, what are we going to position within the roundabout gates? On one side of the gate is the Golden Temple. On the other side of the gate is the Summer Palace. Around is the market, which actually is expecting that by repositioning this monument, they're going to get some tourist footfall, they're going to have increased revenue with improved sales and so on. And those 5 words were reverence, revelation, resonance, remembrance. Yes, I forgot remembrance. Remembrance came out of all the sacrifices that are confessed in history, and reconciliation. So what we decided was that we're going to position this museum as a local sound, and I strongly believe in the local language, the People's Museum, that can give the story of the city of Amritsar in a very simple way and house it within this particular public into this gate, and also give them a public place where they can have small cultural activities. So we converted the gate into, and this was something done as part of the inauguration function. So this exhibition design happened with 35 lakhs. It had nothing to do with a high-end exhibition design. And our piece, the resistance, right in the beginning, is something which Manish Arora did, who is a fashion designer who does very eclectic work. Happens to be from Amritsar. We brought him in. And he worked with, because Amritsar is known for the churas and the leaders, that the bridegroom and the brides wear, and the sehras, and those hars, all these, what to do with a wedding. So we created a chandelier with parandis and churas and, all these bangles and stuff like that. And it became a selfie point for the city. So it created the buzz. So while your studies can be very complex and sound like, oh my God, I see half of you sleeping. But when you kind of intervene in the building, you could do something fun. People don't have to get a lowdown of, the research is for you to enrich your thinking. But what you put out there doesn't have to be the same narrative in a particular packaged. I mean, it needs to be packaged differently. It should be, palatable by the people for whom you're creating. That does not mean dumb it down, because we feel our tourists are dumb. So if you create an inauthentic facade, they will say, "Ye to kilar khada hai yahan par." I think that is dumbing down. This is not dumbing down. If somebody says, "Why have you put the Kalira there?" It's from the clouds of this place. Why have you put the panel at the back, the tree of life? It comes from an iconic tree in the Golden Temple. What are these particular layers of representing? So we created the 5 rooms dedicated to the 5 themes. And we gave the narrative of the story of Amritsar. And should people want to know, there should be the possibility of scratching the surface and going deeper. So that becomes, for our practice, it's a very important practice. So as rites of passage, because the fort was the gate was going to be repositioned with a new use, we also had, by the local tradition, a small kirtan, a little ceremony. Because the day before was a political ceremony with the politicians and the bureaucrats and all of that. But the next day in the morning, we had this particular ceremony where the people from the market came. Because that's distinctly marks, from a very contested, conflicting narrative, taking it into a cultural space. And this is one of the rooms in the upper rooms in the gate, where we put in a 10-minute film on the story of Amritsar. This is something, just a small little intervention to hear the story of the city. There's a little shop there, and of course, in terms of people inviting, so what we had a ceremony called the Jago ceremony, which normally happens in the village or in towns, where people, the house where there's a marriage, this particular ceremony is taken by people who go from house to house, inviting people to the marriage ceremony the next day. So we actually got the local performing artists to actually conduct this particular walk through the bazaar, go all the way to the town hall, inviting the people of the world city that our monument is restored. So come and look at it. So this Jago ceremony went right through the bazaars of Amritsar that night. At the political event, where we had, this is, Keval Dhaliwal is a well-known theatre person from Amritsar. And he enacted a small, he got this little play enacted of the story of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And this is when, inauguration of the project. And this was something which was the epitome, the climax for me, because these little children came to me and they said, because there was monkeys and all playing, and there were lots of the VIP sitting and stuff like that. These little kids came up to me and they said, "We also want to dance." So I said, "Why do you want to dance?" So they said, "Because we have a new school." So this was a validation. So what that long story, which made a lot of you go off to sleep, when I was giving you the complexity of the tangible and the intangible heritage of Amritsar, is because every layer of documentation, every layer of history and understanding manifests itself in the way we dealt with our project, in the process, in the programming, and this was not budgeted by the government. We kind of clobbered the heads of the people we were working with. ये तो करना ही है, ma'am, ये तो करना है, तो बहुत important है. People were like, "Ma'am, because she's a lady." But I must give her the credit that it took a while and a bit of persuasion. But if it wasn't for her, the female commissioner, this would not have been possible. So I have to give the credit where it is due. Anyway, so these are the, so I had to tell the Dholki Balas to practice it. So this is the climax of this particular event. Of course, there were other projects which were related to environmental planning, how the circular road can be used for stormwater management. It can all go into zone 3, where we can do rainwater percolation and all that. So there's that serious side of planning. There's mobility, there's water, there's infrastructure, and then there's a human side. to the conservation practice. Yeah. Of course, there's conservation of the town hall. It houses the parliament. It houses the partition museum, the first museum ever dedicated to partition. We did the Gobinder Fort, not part of this project, but this has been a 10-year experience. A lot of archaeology that was found because when the British took over, when East India East India Company took over the fort, they demolished a lot of it. So the kind of transformation that had happened on the fort of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the archaeology that we discovered, and the sound and light show that happens now on. So those of you who will get to visit Amritsar, you must go and look at this particular sound and show. It's very wonderfully done by somebody from Bombay. It's become like a tourist place, but I find it too touristy because I think some of the processes which I showed you, the small project like Rambagh Gate, was critically missing in the making of the Gobinder Fort. This could have been far more vibrant, much more meaningful to the community. People had forgotten that the Amritsar city even had a fort. This has been 15 years of work. So basically, hidden cultural resources leveraged as potential opportunities to engage with communities. Heritage is for all. Need to identify what support is required to create a people-based environment. Now is a crucial time to engage with arts, crafts, and media to leverage potential for dialogue and partnerships to promote social cohesion, for creating resilient communities. That is unique wealth of the historic city of India, and that is the Amritsar narrative. Thank you.
especially in teaching also, another question is in teaching, conservation practice in school. So what are the tools that perhaps we can introduce students if you want to look at Kubernetes of cultural heritage?
The second part of the question is more difficult. Even if you were to look at the Nara document of authenticity, what the Japanese brought, I think the two very important documents that kind of address your question is one is the Bara Charter, which defined the Australian Charter, which was done in the 1990s, 1999, and it talks about value-based planning. One is that, and then it's the Japanese who defined the Nara, who articulated the Nara document of authenticity, because they had timber temples. And conservation required opening up the temples, replacing timbers, putting it all together. So they defined the authenticity by way of the process, renewal of material, the skills of the master craftsman, the joinery, the detailing. So for them, that kind of took the emphasis away from the European or the Western way of looking at it, where authenticity was defined very, very differently. What we also have embedded in our ancient monuments and archaeological sites in Women's Act. So that's one. So process-based continuity and all of that is something which they have defined. Unfortunately, I mean, we've done some charters. INTAC has done a charter. ECOMOS also had heritage and democracy as something which ECOMOS India had. We hosted the General Assembly in 2017. So there, certain aspects have been addressed, which don't give you specific solutions, but it's a charter which recognizes skills, people, local, and all of that. So maybe you may just be interested in looking at that charter. Not charter, the recommendations that came out of the General Assembly of ECOMOS in 2017 in New Delhi. As far as pedagogy is concerned, that's a difficult one. I think, first of all, I don't think it can be taught just in colleges of architecture. I think we need to start understanding nature, culture, ecology, man as part of the ecosystem, and human beings. And what does it mean to, and this sensitivity has to be inculcated much earlier in life. I don't think you can change people very quickly in few courses, in professional courses, because they've got, in professional courses, there are so many other deliverables and things that they have to do in terms of course structures, and it's very difficult to inculcate something so distinctively different, maybe as an approach. Though I do see flicker of hope in some colleges of architecture, where they're bringing in the other arts into their practice. I'm not too familiar with KRVIA, but I've gone on a similar thing and was invited to Bangalore to the College of Architecture there. And I saw the kind of work that was the first year students were doing into the realm of subjectivity, more into the poetics, the arts, personal expression, and so on, then leading up to architecture. So, I mean, like for instance, cultural heritage is not something you really see. You smell, you taste, you touch, you hear, all of that. So if you're looking at conservation and continuity of a cultural tradition, you're looking at all of the senses to come alive to it. Now, the way we if you become a science student at the age of 15, and all the poetics and all of that is removed from your education, the space of education, you find very few with whom this would resonate. But I'll be happy to be contradicted here. I hope there is more there than what I've seen.
So you spoke about in the presentation about Amritsar and how it's a site which is based on a lot of period of time. And we see that with many sites, it's not only about any signature space around country, but there will be conflict memories or communities that have clashed over a long period of time. And then when we enter as conventional kind of not with the previous sites, it's demanded that we take a more or less neutral position. Which is easy to say, and easy to say it's not, we can't really do that when we're actually practicing on site. How can one, sort of fit in memories of, that particular history? And when you enter such site, how do you deal with these complexities in your experience? Are you giving one example, but possibly it could point towards some others in your experience?
Very interesting what you're saying, because the first project we got in UNESCO Award for in 2002 was the restoration of the temple and in Punjab. The temple is within a small village, which is largely a Dalit population. And it had a lot of other narratives because it belonged to the Thakurs who left during militancy. And people did not have access to the temple during the life of the temple, during the life of the Thakur set. The police station was housed within a temple. In spite of the fact that the Thakurs did not allow them to enter, they actually rallied around the protection of the temple because attached to the temple was a large village pond. And when the Thakurs sold all their land and went off from the village, they also sold that particular tank as well. So the local big landlord was going to fill it up. And these people wanted to protect the water tank because that's what the drainage of the city was, of the village was dependent on that. So they protected the temple. They got a high court order to set up a temple trust. And so when we went to do conservation and all of that, there was a narrative that we had to deal with. Then at one point, the temple was also a police station. So apparently the people were very upset because the police was using it very badly. Now, this is the narrative you pick up. There is stories that linger, their memories, their associations and all of that. And then there was the current political scenarios. The village Dalits was associated with one political party. The man who had bought the land was associated with another political party. Now, at that point, I met I find my answers talking to the professors in sociology. I kind of hold them up there. And I spoke to Dr. Oberoi, Professor Oberoi, and I asked him, and he said, Gurmeet, your work should be relevant for 1,000 years. And I said, what is he saying? How can your work, the monument is not going to stand there for 1,000 years. So what does that mean? And it took me a while to understand what he meant was the principles that you uphold in the conservation process should be relevant, should be timeless. Okay? Now park that on one side. How that manifests in your work methodology is something you have to develop. The craft of it is your work on it. But you've got to understand that reverence of life or to life, whatever, is something which becomes critical. Now, then to make this knowledge more accessible and applicable, he said a few things too. I got this from my second, who was his student, Dr. Sabyasachi. He mentioned, he said, there's certain principles because there were 6 of us in the village while we were working on this project. And he said, a few things that you have to put in place. One is, don't encourage any conversations about any subject outside your own area of work, which is heritage conservation. When you're not there, people should say, these people are mad. They only understand brick and lime. They don't understand anything else. Let that person come and tell you about the politics and this like. But you said, but they can't eat kahan se aaye hain. So they should realize you're some sort of wackos, The other thing he said was, do not encourage conversation of another person in the absence of that person. It should not be that somebody can misinterpret. Third thing he said was, do not accept invitations to people's homes. Because that puts a particular, what will go across to communities is that they have to be well provided for to be able to host you, which means a very poor man will not have access to. He will not access to you. He will be hesitant and reaching out to you and say, please, because he's not going to take you to his, home. Make yourself available in a public place. And we were restoring a temple. He said they should know the discipline of 9 to 5, why that routine is important. They should know if anybody who wants to talk to you can meet you there, and you will be available to everybody from 9 to 5 and be there. Do not go to any VIP room. And so these were some of these principles he told us. And I forget the fourth one. There were 4 principles he told us. And he said, just go with this. And you realize that you don't have to think about the question as a very complex question. You translated your actions into the craft that you know and anchor it in those principles, and your answers are embedded in that. So after this, we restored a mosque, which was built by the Sikh Guru, which was looked after by the Nihang Singhs, who look very kind of militant. And when we started restoring it, and they had positioned the Guru Granth Sahib inside the mosque because there's no Muslim population there, we actually worked towards, a lot of material is available online on that called Guru Ki Masjid. And we actually worked towards an MOU that needed to be signed, that was signed between the Punjab Waqf Board and the Nihang Singhs. And the fact that this particular MOU was signed, the conservation happened, and Syed Shahabuddin, who is a member of parliament at that point, questioned in the parliament that a mosque is being converted into a gurdwara in Gurdaspur. And so there was a human rights inquiry that was set up. We were at the mosque. We all went to the police station. We all gave answers. And one film, the Nihang Singh says, we will restore this monument. We will restore it with the materials that it is built with it. And we will ensure that nobody will break this mosque and it will be there in perpetuity. And he speaks on camera like that. So what I'm saying is that the same thing, which sounds like contested, actually can become a huge, huge symbolic social capital that you could be generating. But just don't get overwhelmed when it's very complex. That's a big one, because your body language can be read by other people that you're overwhelmed. So I thought there was a hand there. Okay.
I've visited Amritsar 2 times and around the Golden Temple. The question is very misread a few things, going beyond the Golden Temple into some of the lands. And I feel there's a fracture. And we talk about communities, and of course, the reason I went into those areas, the food is wonderful, and I sort of found the wrong place to go in, and I couldn't find a place. And that is my walk into the model around the temple. Of course, everything around the temple from the Jagannath part and that walk that you show is fantastic. But there is no community. People have left. And that was scary. It was like a ghost town. So, and of course, these are private properties, and it's very difficult even for the government to sort of intervene and bring back these communities of people who have this entitled land, who live there. And I sometimes feel maybe, again, it's a reference point, that gentrification is sometimes good for, it's a top statement. And does it work? I don't know. I'm not a conservation practitioner. But how do you bring back communities? It's very important. Otherwise, those buildings don't survive, and that whole area is decaying. So, just the thoughts that came to my mind.
Yeah, that's precisely the point about the Heritage Street. See, the Heritage Street, first of all, while it's some sort of traffic calming around the Buddha temple, it's actually alleviated the community in a big way. Even the aesthetics of the Heritage Street is a problematic intervention. So there's it came in with, it was a political decision. Obviously, these kind of projects only come with that. Yeah. And it actually, all the activities that used to be on the field with you, it was something which the Deputy Chief Minister decided should be done, and it should be done in 12 months because there were going to be elections, and therefore they put in a lot of money in intervening. If it had to be done in a more meaningful way, the methodology would have been a little different. I would say it's something like what we did with the roundabout gates. You know, where you need to work with communities, you've got to work out your mobility, you've got to work out your drainage, you've got to work out your, and I would then overlay something, like every building doesn't have to survive either. We've got to, then I would bring in the methodology recommended by or developed by Sir Patrick Geddes on conservative surgery. Some things have to go. But meanwhile, also through regulation, we also have to ensure that properties don't get consolidated. Because what is also happening parallelly is that people are buying each other out on the principal streets and you're getting larger parcels of land. When you get larger parcels of land, you've got to do a setback. You can do a taller building. The building texture changes. So while you've got to guide that development. So I'm not anti new uses or new building activity, but we through our Vivid plan have actually developed a toolkit where we said what the methodology should be in terms of arriving at the architectural vocabulary. Some buildings should be protected, some buildings should be bought out by maybe government, maybe societies for a certain use. But I mean, if you look at what Europe has done or any other country with the legacy like ours has done, has worked consistently with a shared vision between the multiple stakeholders. Our urban local bodies neither have the resources, nor the skills, nor the intention to pick from.
We end with the discussion now. Thank you for this thought-provoking presentation, Gurmeet. It has been wonderful to have you here.